everyone. I'm Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet, and I am back home again. I was back home again recently to do a few videos for, I guess you could call it spring break, but I'm actually done with my first year of college now, so I will be back home again and hopefully putting out content a little bit more regularly. I don't know how much more regularly, just because I also have a new summer job now. I'm not going to go into detail about any of that, but it is a full-time Monday through Friday job. So I am not going to have as much time on my hands to edit as I did last summer when, with the exception of like towards the end, I had just an absurd amount of time on my hands. But I will hopefully have, because I'm not loaded down with schoolwork, a little bit more time to make more content and interact with y'all a little bit more, because the YouTube community is important to me, and the friends I've made there are just as important as anybody I've met at college. So I'm back, and I'm doing another horror movie review. But before I get into that, I'm also just gonna say it's Pride Month again. Last June, I came out as a romantic and asexual, and I'm very comfy in that now. But this June, I came out again, kind of. It's kind of been out there a little bit for a while, but I am genderqueer. That's kind of the label I'm using. Gender fluid as well kind of also applies. I am something that doesn't quite adhere to the gender binary of man or woman, so just genderqueer and non-binary in general kind of apply to that. But the fact that I am so uncertain of what label might fit, and I keep switching between things, makes me think gender fluid does especially fit. So that's a thing. It has nothing to do with this, but I came out again. Happy Pride to all of my fellow queer horror fans. My pronouns are he, they. Please respect them. I'm also going to put on this ring that Tristan sent me because I forgot to do that this morning. And with that out of the way, I am going to get into this review, which is a review of the movie Flowers. This is a film directed by Phil Stevens, and he actually sent me this Blu-ray as a screener to review the film. Unfortunately, it did not play in my Blu-ray player. There were some issues with the disc. I am not going to blame that on Phil, or is it Borderline, the company that released this, because hopefully this is just an anomaly and it's just this one disc that's jacked up. I was bummed that that happened, but luckily Phil has the movie up on his YouTube channel, so I was able to watch it from there. Just because it's readily accessible, you know, on YouTube, I really appreciate that Phil went out of his way to send me a physical screener of the movie, just out of the kindness of his heart. But once again, it is a film directed by Phil Stevens, and Phil Stevens has also directed the movies Lung and Lung 2, Miasma and Below Man, and this film stars Colette Kinney McKenna, who was in Lung 2 as well as this movie, along with Flowers 2, and did lots of other work on Flowers, as did many of these other actors. I didn't go into detail as to what all of them did, but all of them were very hands-on in the making of this film besides just being actors. Crystal Fitch, whose only credit is this film, in which she did acting but also makeup stuff. Anastasia Blue, whose only credit is this film, who also did makeup and sets. Tanya Aaron Paoli, who was in Undead Zombie Hookers, which is kind of a redundant name because if they're zombies, that kind of already implies they're undead, but whatever. Daisy Durkins, Daughter of the Damned, and Evil Brew. Kara A. Christensen, and Makaraya Sapatoris, I hope I did not butcher your name, who was also in the film IBS and did casting, costumes, set, and production work for Flowers. And Flowers is very much an art movie, so it's going to be hard to give a synopsis of this. It's any kind of linear, but basically a bunch of presumably girls or, you know, feminine presenting people wake up in this gritty interior of some kind of building, and they're just kind of meandering around there, crawling through all kinds of filth and decay, and gradually remembering traumatic events from their past. Yeah, that's the whole synopsis I can give you, because this movie is somewhat abstract, very kind of symbolic and surrealist about certain things. It also has no dialogue whatsoever, and not really any vocalization even. Like when one of the characters, they're just referred to as the flowers, like just like flower number one, flower number two, etc. But even when they're like screaming, you don't hear that. You just see them screaming, and the soundtrack might get a little bit more intense. But yeah, that's kind of the whole plot of the movie. There will be spoilers for what that's worth, because again, this is a more abstract film, but there is a gradual reveal of things that I will be talking about, and if you don't want that spoiled for you, you might want to go into this one blind. But going into this movie blind, know that this is not only an art house film, it is very much an extreme horror film. So if you have a problem with intense gore, discussions and depictions of sexual assaults, sexual violence, self-mutilation, drug use, all kinds of just very traumatic, graphic, and upsetting stuff, pretty much all of that is in this. It's not delved into in the most upsetting way I've ever seen, but some of it gets really upsetting, and it is dealt with in a very upfront, extreme, and graphic way. So if that is not for you, do not watch this movie. But if you want to just get, hit with the truck that is this movie and just go into it blind, don't watch my review yet, because I'm gonna spoil it. The music for this film was done by Mark Kefner. It's spelled Kueffner. Again, apologies if I'm butchering anyone's name, just please correct me so I can get it right next time. Mark also did the scores for Anomaly, Root of Darkness, the documentary Against All Odds Surviving the Holocaust, and numerous episodes of various TV things. Very prolific, actually. His score is very ambient and kind of electronic, and it's almost devoid of melody. It's very kind of grimy and fits with the overall just gritty atmospheric vibe that this movie has, and it almost blends with the overall sound design of the movie, kind of the way the soundtrack for something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre works, except this is even more arty and abstract than Texas Chainsaw. And the sound design is good. There were some parts where I was like, oh, this could be even better, because there's parts where the soundtrack is just going ham and you aren't really hearing realistic sounds of what's happening, and there's just these violent impacts happening that I thought would be extra frightening if there was more sort of realistic thuds and sounds of impact. But this is more just a surreal, symbolic depiction of the horrifying things happening. And the more intense this movie got, the gladder I was that the sound effects didn't strive for realism. So I actually am fine with the way it works, because I kind of needed that filter of abstraction and surrealism to deal with the shit that this movie gets into. And there are a few more kind of traditionally soundtracky melodic bits. They are few, but when they do happen, they are special, and I really like them. For example, these girls, the flowers, will all at some point in the film find a photo that I assume is meant to be themselves. And when they do, a lot of times there will be this like little bit of like a choral, high-pitched, sing-songy voice mixed into the soundtrack that I thought was cool. So it's kind of this haunting, slightly playful reminder of maybe a happier time. I don't know. There's also a point in the film where there's just these very low pipe organ-y sounding bits that I thought were really cool. And there's one particular scene, which is the scene where one of the flowers is in front of a mirror unstitching herself. I will get more into that in a little bit, but she is unstitching herself and kind of remaking herself, and that is probably the most overtly big and melodic place where the score is really allowed to shine. And there's some haunting piano and some violin and some more orchestral sounds that kind of build, and it's still not bombastic in the way like a big epic movie score would be, or like a slasher film score would be, but it's this kind of uneasy but contemplative, interesting moment. And I think having this somewhat more elegant and less abstract score really helped that scene in a way that I really appreciated. And again, music and sound design are things that this movie really hinges on just because it doesn't have dialogue. But another thing it really hinges on for that reason is obviously going to be the visuals. And that is where I think this movie really knocks it out of the park, because the production design is phenomenal, especially considering the budget that I'm assuming this had, because it's a lot of people who haven't really worked on other things. It seems like a very kind of small group of acquaintances just making something with what they have and what they can scrounge up from other people. And what comes out of that is kind of breathtaking, because it understands like the elements of like an extreme grindhouse movie and the elements of just like a weird abstract art movie, and how to really combine those in this beautiful way, because it sees the beauty and in just the aesthetics of things that people would usually find disgusting. So there's corpses and stitched up flesh and just grime and filth everywhere. And it's supposed to be repulsive in a lot of ways, but it's very artistically arranged, and there's clearly a lot of thought put into it. The characters are just kind of wandering around this dilapidated building or series of dilapidated buildings that are shot to look like one big decaying hellscape, and it has this feeling of just this unending hell that almost felt like a less fantastical and more horrific adult version of the kind of landscapes Alice wanders through in the 80s surrealist stop motion infused adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, Alice. I am not saying the director's name because I'm worried I'll butcher it again, but I'll put it down here because it's a really cool movie. It's just this whole just world of decaying things that feel somewhat naturalistic, but also feel very artistically arranged to say things. What exactly they're saying, I'm not usually sure. But the production design on this movie is just really cool. And even though it looks like something you could cut your hand on and get 5 different diseases, it was very aesthetically pleasing to me. And I should probably go into the effects from there, because the gore in this movie, holy shit. It's not a slasher movie or a body horror movie or a splatter movie, really, but it is a very gory, uncomfortable film. And the gore in this movie, you can usually tell to some degree that it's a makeup effect. Maybe that's just because I've watched enough of these movies, because sometimes it looks really real and really painful. But there's definitely a degree of imperfection to the gore in this, but it looks real enough to be stomach churning. And just, there's sometimes where you're just like, I have no doubt that that came out of inside a person, because it's very bloody and slimy. I don't know what it is I'm looking at exactly right now, but it's slimy enough that it is icking me out. And I thought that was really well done. And there's scenes where people just have to crawl through sludge, and even knowing that it's a makeup effect, I know that that actor has to be miserable crawling through that much sludge. So props to them and to the makeup effects people. And probably the most standout makeup effects for me in this is the stitched up chests of the flowers, because I'm going to spoil a little bit of the plot for you now, but essentially all of these flowers are dead. They've all been killed by the same person, and they've had their innards removed, and I guess they're wandering around in some kind of limbo and do not know that they're dead, because they have these horrific moments of realization where they open up their shirts and see these stitches going down their chest, and then they open it up to find like nothing inside. And the scene I was talking about before that has the really cool score is one where one of the flowers opens up the chest and starts, packing their innards back in and stuffing dirt inside and sewing it back up. And it's very uneasy, but also kind of oddly beautiful. It's weird, but this whole movie is weird, so it works, I think. But yeah, that's one of the best executed effects in the movie. The other one is a really simple one, but the most painful looking one, and it's always the really simple ones that get you. And it's just a scene where one of the flowers is trying to kick down a door, but the door has all these nails poking out of it, and I'm assuming all of them are she, because we don't know anything about who they are, but the movie, as far as I know, considers them women. So she is trying to kick down this door to get through it, but there's all these nails poking out of it. And she kicks it, and there's no real sound effects conveying it. She just looks kind of stunned, and then she looks at the door, and her foot has gone right through one of those nails, and she has to pull it off, and ow, that hurt to watch. Even not so much the putting the foot through the nail, but the more so the pulling it off of the nail. Ow. Which brings us to the story and characters overall, which I think this movie, as mean-spirited as the entire plot is, or as just nasty as the whole plot is, I don't know if it's mean-spirited. It feels like it has good intentions in what it's trying to say, but I don't know if it entirely works. And again, it's such an abstracted film that I don't know what the intent of the directors or the writers or any of the creators is, so I can't necessarily speak to that, but it felt like it was upsetting to prove a point, but I'm not sure the point entirely worked. But overall, again, big content warning for sexual assault in this movie, which is depicted. The first kind of implied scene of sexual assault, there is nudity. It is graphic in its way, but it is more gory than anything. Actual penetration is not depicted, but everything kind of leading up to it is, and then there are just kind of cutaways of close-ups of things that are implying it, and it's really nasty, and I did not like watching it. But if you're thinking it's actually going to be like pornographically graphic, it isn't. It's still upsetting. And in that case, it does not feel like it is sexualizing it. It's very much depicting it as this disgusting, horrifying thing that is happening. But that doesn't make it any less fucking upsetting to watch. I would rather have not seen that. But again, that is, I think, one of the things this movie is addressing. Also, at first I was just like, okay, so we are seeing most of these female bodies nude. There are boobs in this movie, but it isn't being eroticized, so why is there not equal opportunity nudity in this movie? And there is, briefly. I appreciate that the playing field is kind of level in that way, but also, why is it only ever the most upsetting movies with incredibly horrific scenes of trauma that have the most equal opportunity nudity in them? I'm looking at you, Midsommar. The only exception I can really think of is Blood of the Tribbids, which is still a very horrific film, but with this degree of camp to it. There's no camp in this movie. It's just depraved and miserable. But yeah, it's only under absolutely horrifying circumstances that I've ever seen equal to opportunity nudity in a film, especially a horror film. Other horror films will have, female nudity out the wazoo in non-horrific scenes. Other horror movies don't tend to really do that in non-horrific scenes, but they are mostly made by straight men, so there you have it. I'm going off on a tangent that has nothing to do with the plot of this movie, but the characters, I think, are conveyed pretty amazingly considering what there is of them, especially because there's no dialogue in this. The actors have to convey what the characters are doing and feeling through straight up pantomime and face acting and just conveying emotion that way, and it is done amazingly. I may not have known exactly what the motivations, feelings, or thoughts running through the heads of those characters were at the time, but there are these scenes where there's clearly just some kind of wild process going through a character's head, namely things like, the scenes of realization of, oh god, there's nothing in my chest, I'm a stitched up corpse, or the scene in front of the mirror. There's a lot of great acting going on there. And then just actual character backstory stuff is conveyed through flashbacks of these characters being assaulted and murdered. So the characters are very effectively conveyed without using any dialogue at all, but all I'm really getting is that they were murdered and they are still in a kind of limbo going through the trauma of the fact that they were murdered. Or maybe trying to remember they were murdered so they can leave limbo. That's kind of the impression I was getting, but I don't know. I personally would have really liked, even though this is very much a movie that is about misogyny and violence and how it has destroyed these characters, and that is what it is very much focused on. It would have been nice to have just a little bit more of a remnant of the people they were before those horrific events. Not even just full scenes of, oh, them having a nice day or anything like that, but just like scenes of just like, I don't know, a little trinket that reminds them of a friend they used to have, or just a happiness they had before this horrific murder that happened, because that would make them all a little bit more distinctive as characters, and it would also just make knowing what happened to him that much more gut-wrenching instead of wallowing in just pure misery, because this movie has its aesthetic of just filth and grime and misery down, but having just a small contrast to that in the midst of all of it would make it that much more horrific when we go back to, oh geez, this is what happened to this person. And it does seem to some degree like these characters are meant to be more symbolic of horrific things that have happened to women and AFAB people and feminine presenting people, more than actual like fleshed out characters. But I don't always know what they're meant to be symbolic of, because there's also other little things sprinkled in that I wasn't sure what they meant. Again, very abstract movie. And as far as the landscape and the way the production design is laid out, I really liked the way it seems to take place in like this world, a sort of hell or again limbo, that's made out of the collective trauma of these characters and maybe even other people, because there's other things that just imply very vulnerable, traumatic things. Like there's just a random child's room that someone peers into, and you can just hear the cries of a child on the soundtrack, and it's very eerie. And there's also like a sex room, I guess, which was probably the least frightening thing in the movie, because it's just like a couple of pretty obviously like plastic skeletons put in like a sex position with like some kind of pornographic movie playing on the TV over there, and it's just this really weird little tableau that I don't love looking at, but it's kind of goofy. I couldn't completely take it seriously. I don't know what the intent was there. It was, again, kind of weird, like the rest of the movie. There's also kind of a pig motif running through the film with these weird, like, stitched up pig carcasses in places that look like they're supposed to kind of maybe be vaguely anthropomorphic sometimes, or just like a pig's head laying somewhere. Yeah, that's a thing that's there in the movie. I'm guessing there's some kind of symbolism there because it shows up so often. Maybe they just thought pigs' heads are creepy, and they're right. It was a very intriguing, repeated image throughout the film. There's a scene where one of the characters is just stuffing their face with food, and then realizes, oh god, it's actually a bunch of like super decayed food that has become sludge, and then throws it all back up again, which is probably more uncomfortable than any of the scenes of gore in the film. So content warning for vomit as well. Nothing too realistic again, and there's no like retching sounds or anything because it's all just abstract soundtrack, but it's not pleasant to watch. Also in that scene, I was like, I wonder how the animal handling on this movie went, because there's a lot of bugs and worms mixed into that, and I thought that was very well done. And I know, bugs are not easy to wrangle particularly. I think worms would be easier, but like there are just like little bugs and flies crawling around on one of the dead pigs. And I thought that was very impressive, unless that's an actual dead pig that was attracting flies, in which case, why? Why would you do that? And again, I really liked the mirror scene because it feels like it is this scene where this character is trying so hard to be what they used to be, and it's just not happening. Or it is kind of happening. Like, she gets up and she walks back out of the room because she, like, takes off her dress, realizes the scars are there, like, does her makeup again, rips open her chest, stuffs her heart back in, stitches it back up, and puts on a new dress. So there's this semi-maybe empowering thing going on there, but it's also kind of this uneasy bit of the score playing while it's happening. Again, it's one of the most beautiful pieces in the movie, so it's kind of bittersweet and emotionally vague, which I liked. But at the same time, there's all these images of just like models from magazines just like along the side of the mirror, and it feels very much like almost she's being pressured to be this thing that she's supposed to be this okay, put together thing, despite the horrific bullshit that she's been through, even though she's even, kind of dead. So I thought there were some interesting themes and images being played around with there. Again, not really sure what the intent behind them was, but it was definitely interesting and my favorite scene in the movie. And for most of the film, it's just them wandering around, going through gnarly little tableaus and remembering traumatic events from their past. And I was like, when are they finally going to meet and band together to break out of this hellscape? And then they finally meet and sit down in this table in this one room. And it's just this final scene of them all watching this TV that's kind of been hinted at throughout the movie, just because there's like little transitions that are TV static, like from one of the flowers to the other. But then they're just sitting there watching this TV, watching each one's little horrific events in full, and then it'll cut back and one of them has disappeared. It just kind of gradually shows how each of them were killed by the same person, mind you, and then it finally just cuts to all of them gone, and then all of these just dead female bodies in this man's room. This guy is a serial killer rapist monster, and that's the way the movie ends, and I hate it. And I hate it even more because that is one of the sequences in which we see actual penetration. I think it's what it looks like. I was not there for that. I don't even quite know what the context for it was, but it was in there and it was very graphic and we didn't need to see that. It was very well implied earlier. You had enough horrific imagery in there already. You were already extreme with the subject matter and all of that. I am pretty sure that was gone about ethically and consensually in real life in a way that was not hurting anyone. But I didn't need to see it. But I also just was not about the ending. I know that this is a movie about kind of the lack of justice that there are for these characters, and they're just kind of wandering around in their own trauma until they die because no one was there to help them. But I really wanted them to like if I had written this, it would totally have just been like, oh, their spirits wake up in this hellscape, they band together, they wake up their bodies again, and the final scene is this guy sitting there, all the bodies get up and tear him to pieces, which would be very satisfying. I don't know if that's really the tone this movie has, but that's what I would have liked to happen, personally. But again, I don't know what the intent of this movie was. It feels to kind of just linger on this note of just pure despair, though, and there's definitely a message of this is the shit that happens to women and people with vaginas and feminine presenting people. Anyone that, might get targeted like this shit happens a lot all the time, and this guy's consistently getting away with it. But yeah, there's not any kind of real emotional dynamic to it. It just kind of lingers on that one note of horrifying despair. That said, I did appreciate this film for what it is. I really thought the makeup effects were great, if hard to look at. I thought the acting was really strong. I love the mirror scene, I love the score, and I absolutely adore the production design. So if you can stomach this movie, I think it is worth watching. But if it is something that you're gonna not want to watch ever based on what I've said, don't. To Phil Stevens and to everyone who worked on this film, to be honest, I would be very interested in hearing back from you on what your intent was behind this film. I'd love to pick your brains and just hear more about the intent and the artistic process behind this film, because I wouldn't say I enjoyed it, but I definitely appreciated a lot of aspects of it, and for that I think it is worth checking out. Once again, this is a movie that you can watch for free on YouTube. I will link both cuts of the film that Phil Stevens has on his YouTube channel, because there is a color cut and a black and white noir cut. I think they're just the same movies, one's in color, one's in black and white, just for different experiences, but I will be linking those either in the cards or below or both. And if you want to get a Blu-ray from Borderline Films, they definitely do exist. Thank you again to Phil for sending this one to me, despite the fact that it did not work in my Blu-ray player. I do really appreciate the thought. That is my review of Flowers. thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!